Well, you break your arm. The X-ray shows a jagged white line, right? And the doctor points at the screen and says, well, there it is.
Right, it is right there in black and white.
Yeah, we expect that same kind of precision when we look at war, you know? Welcome to this deep dive on reform thinking. It is really great to have you here.
Glad to be here. And you were totally right about the expectations we bring to this topic. Usually, when we're talking about a geopolitical crisis or a military conflict, there is an expectation of clean mathematics.
Right, like looking at a map.
Well, precisely. You look at the map, you see the territorial lines drawn in red and blue, and you can point to the specific locations of the battalions. It is visible. It is categorical.
But then, you step into the world of displaced families, the unseen domestic toll of a war, and suddenly that X-ray machine is broken.
Well,
We are looking at a diagnostic landscape that is incredibly murky.
it is. It is very hard to pin down.
How do you actually measure the toll of a war? I mean, is it through the billions of dollars in emergency cash assistance, or the logistical strain on the European Union? Or is it through the spiritual and emotional fracturing of the basic family unit?
That is the core question, really.
So today, we're looking at the devastating impact of the Ukraine-Russia war on women and families. And we have two radically different sources on the table to help us unpack this.
Right, and they are very different.
Yeah. The first is a secular, data-driven essay. It focuses on social policy, massive labor shifts, and the mechanics of emergency relief. But the second is a strict theological essay diagnosing the identical crisis, but through a confessional, reformed Christian lens.
Before we get into the details,
Yeah.
we really have to establish a firm operating rule for our conversation today.
I think that is a really good idea.
The sources we are looking at contain strong ideological, theological, and political viewpoints. The goal for us today is simply to impartially report and analyze the ideas contained in these original texts side by side.
Right. We're just laying out what they say.
Yes. We are not endorsing the secular sociological policies, nor are we endorsing the specific theological conclusions in this context. Our objective is to lay out both arguments clearly so you, the listener, can consider the massive contrast in how human suffering is interpreted and addressed.
I think that is a vital disclaimer, because these texts do not pull their punches at all. Let's start with the sheer scale of displacement, because the numbers in the data-driven source are just staggering.
They really are.
We are looking at a situation where, by December 2025, an estimated 5.86 million refugees from Ukraine will remain outside the country.
Wow, over 5.5 million.
Yeah, and mostly scattered across Europe. And on top of that, there are 3.7 million internally displaced people inside Ukraine.
So you are talking about nearly 10 million people not in their original home.
Right. And looking ahead to 2026, the projection is that 10.8 million people will require direct humanitarian assistance. But the secular source points out a specific demographic reality here that shapes everything else we are going to talk about today.
Yes, the demographic breakdown is crucial.
This refugee population is overwhelmingly made up of women and children.
And that demographic skew is not an accident of geography or personal preference.
Yeah.
It is a direct result of state policy.
Right, because of the martial law.
Yes. Men of military age face strict restrictions on leaving Ukraine due to martial law and mobilization requirements. So you have a forced, systemic separation of the family unit.
Which changes the entire dynamic of the refugee crisis.
It does. The sociological text argues that this specific dynamic turns the family into a central social battleground. The war is not just happening in the trenches in the East.
Where else is it happening?
It is happening in the kitchens and living rooms of temporary shelters in Warsaw, Berlin, and Prague. Women are suddenly forced to act as wage earners, displaced heads of households, care managers, and informal social workers.
All at the same time.
All at the same time, yeah. And without the traditional support structures they relied on back home.
The secular source phrases it in a way that really sticks with you. It says geopolitical violence translates into everyday struggles.
I think that captures it perfectly.
I mean, anyone who manages a household knows how stressful it is to budget on a normal Tuesday, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Now imagine the panic of budgeting with a disrupted income. Plus, the desperate search for safe work in a country where you might not speak the language. And, the unimaginable task of explaining air raid sirens to small children.
It is a totally different level of stress.
The home front is intensely gendered. Women are highly visible as agents of resilience. They are running businesses and organizing massive volunteer networks. But they are also absorbing an invisible, emotionally crushing amount of unpaid labor just to keep their families from falling apart.
Now, when we bring in the theological text, it
Hmm.
introduces a completely different analytical framework for this exact identical demographic reality.
Okay, so how do they look at it?
It frames this massive forced migration not just as a sociological crisis, but as a providential crucible.
A providential crucible. That is a heavy turn.
It is. This source flatly rejects the idea that this is just the result of blind geopolitics, chance, or the chaotic whims of a purposeless universe.
Right.
It cites Ephesians chapter 1, verse 11, which talks about God working all things according to the counsel of his will. And it points to chapter 5 of the Westminster Confession of Faith.
Remind me what that chapter focuses on.
It argues that God sovereignly governs all creatures and all actions, from the greatest to the least. Yet in that sovereign decree, he permits the grievous consequences of human sin.
I have to admit, that is a tough concept to wrap your head around if you are reading this from a purely secular standpoint.
It is a massive paradigm shift.
Because how does the theological text square the idea of a sovereign governing God with the reality of a bombed-out apartment building, right? Or a mother forced to flee with her children in the middle of the night?
It is a question of diagnosis.
Because the secular view looks at the rubble and sees a failure of international diplomacy. The theological view seems to be looking at the identical rubble and diagnosing a failure of the human soul.
Well, the confessional author addresses that tension by pointing directly to the doctrine of total depravity.
Okay.
The text references Jeremiah chapter 17, verse 9, which describes the human heart as deceitful above all things and desperately sick.
Right.
It argues that war is the ultimate, inevitable expression of sinful rebellion against God's order. The true casualty here, according to this view, is not just lost territory or economic output.
What is it then?
It is the biblical institution of the family. The author looks at the identical demographic reality, millions of displaced souls, mostly women and children, and sees a pastoral crisis of epic proportions.
So it is not just an economic issue for them.
Not at all. Where the sociologist sees an interrupted wage or a disrupted school district, the theologian sees a violent assault upon the covenantal structure of the home.
It is like looking at a burning house.
How so?
Well, the secular sociologist arrives on the scene with a clipboard. They measure the temperature of the flames, assess the structural damage to the load-bearing walls, and calculate the cost of the fire retardant needed to stop it.
Right, they're measuring the physical reality of the disaster.
Yes. But the theologian arrives, ignores the clipboard entirely, asks what moral failing started the fire in the first place, and looks to the sky for rain. They are completely different ways of diagnosing the tragedy.
Which forces us to look at how these differing diagnoses dictate the proposed remedies.
Because the diagnosis always drives the treatment.
Yes, when you view a crisis purely through the lens of statistics and sociology, your proposed solutions will naturally demand systemic policy changes. You push for better labor laws, more efficient cash transfers, optimized housing logistics.
Right, all the nuts and bolts of a functioning state.
But when you view that same crisis as a spiritual rupture, as the theological text does, you mourn the fracture of a biblical institution.
So they are aiming at completely different goals.
They are. The secular text wants to build stronger state institutions to support these burdened women. The theological text mourns the loss of male protection in the home and points toward the need for spiritual regeneration and reliance on the local church.
But, this philosophical debate does not exist in a vacuum. It plays out in the daily grind of survival, which brings us to the massive labor shifts happening in Ukraine.
The economic data here is really striking.
Yeah, the economic data from the first source paints a picture of a country trying to keep its economy breathing while suffocating from a lack of manpower. Since the full-scale invasion began, Ukraine has lost over a quarter of its workforce.
Over 25%. That is a massive hit to any economy.
And nearly 60% of businesses are reporting acute shortages of skilled workers. Think of the Ukrainian wartime economy like an engine losing oil.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
The men leaving for the front lines is the oil draining out. Out of pure necessity, women are stepping in as the emergency synthetic oil, keeping the pistons from fusing together.
That is a very vivid way to describe it.
We are talking about women being rapidly trained to drive heavy logistics trucks, operate tractors, go down into the mines, and run industrial production.
And while women are taking on these physically demanding, traditionally male-dominated roles, the financial realities they face remain incredibly grim.
Let's talk about the pay gap, because that part surprised me.
Before the full-scale invasion, Ukraine had a gender pay gap of 18.6%. But the data shows that even with women stepping into these critical sectors, The pay gap has widened during the war, especially for displaced women.
Hold on a second. Why would the pay gap widen if women are taking on these higher paying industrial jobs? You would think doing the heavy lifting would shrink the gap.
You would think so, right? But it comes down to the mechanics of displacement and entry-level wages.
How does that work?
When a displaced woman takes a job in a new region or a new country, she often lacks the local certifications, the language proficiency, or the professional network she had back home.
Ah, so she is starting from scratch.
Yes. So she enters these vital industries at the lowest possible wage tier. Furthermore, many displaced women are forced into the informal shadow economy.
Where labor protections just do not exist.
Right, simply because they need flexible hours to care for their children.
Hmm.
The burden of unpaid childcare has skyrocketed. It jumped from an average of 49 hours a week pre-war to 56 hours a week now.
So they are working more, resting less, and earning a smaller fraction of what their male counterparts used to make.
Yes, it is a compounding pressure.
So the secular source looks at this massive forced shift and interprets it as an exposure of the artificial nature of pre-war gender boundaries.
They see it as a revelation almost.
Yeah, it argues that what was culturally coded as men's work has simply been revealed as necessary work. Women are doing it, and doing it well, keeping the arteries of the wartime economy flowing.
And the international community is paying attention to this.
Right. Organizations like the OECD are actually looking at this and arguing that sustaining this occupational diversity is vital for an inclusive recovery after the war.
So they want to keep these changes in place permanently.
They want to see these barriers permanently removed, essentially upgrading the economic engine to run on this new reality indefinitely.
The theological source, however, mounts a fierce rejection of that entire framing.
I figured they would have a different take.
They do? The second text views these forced labor shifts through the lens of strict complementarianism.
Let's define that term for the listener, because it is central to the second source's argument. Strict complementarianism is the theological view that men and women have distinct, non-interchangeable roles ordained by God, particularly in the home and the church. Right?
That is the core of it, yes. It contrasts with egalitarianism, which argues that roles should be based on gifting rather than gender.
Okay, so how does this view apply to women in the workforce during a war?
The theological text looks back to the dawn of creation, citing Genesis chapter 2, verse 15. It notes the Hebrew verbs for working and keeping the garden, which it ties specifically to the male duties of provision and protection. It also cites 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 8, arguing that men are divinely ordained to bear the primary weight of providing for the household.
The theological text is incredibly blunt here. It states that forcing women into the labor market to do heavy industrial work while simultaneously raising fatherless children is a direct consequence of the fall.
They do not mince words.
No. It frames this as a tragedy, not an egalitarian victory. It harshly criticizes liberal sociology and feminist ideology for celebrating the sheer desperation as some sort of progressive strike against the patriarchy.
The confessional perspective sees the removal of male headship from the home due to the war as a devastating affliction.
So while the secular world applauds the workforce expansion,
Right, and the forced independence of these women, the confessional text mourns the heavy wheels of a wartime economy grinding these mothers down.
that is a stark contrast.
They are thrust into foreign fields or heavy labor, battling language barriers and exhaustion, which the theological text views as a severe disruption of God's normative design for human flourishing.
The secular source provides an anecdote that really grounds this philosophical tension. It tells the story of a female truck driver.
I remember that part. It is a powerful story.
She has taken on this vital, heavy logistics role to keep the supply chains moving across borders. But to do this, to actually perform this essential job, she has to rely entirely on her own elderly parents to watch her teenage children while she drives these long, hauling routes.
That single anecdote perfectly illustrates the clash between the two frameworks.
How so?
Well, the secular worldview looks at that truck driver and sees immense resilience. They see a worker keeping the economy alive, a patriot contributing to the war effort, and an opportunity to permanently close a wage gap by integrating women into logistics.
Right. They want to support her with better state policy, subsidized childcare, fair wage laws, easier licensing.
Yes, policy solutions. But the theological text looks at her burdened hands, the calluses from the steering wheel, the fact that she is separated from her teenagers for weeks at a time, and sees an unnatural tragedy brought on by human depravity.
It is a fundamental tension between pragmatic, economic survival and a rigid adherence to a defined biblical order.
And if you were listening to this and thinking, Well, of course women should get equal pay and support for driving a truck. You have to realize how violently the second text pushes back on your modern assumptions about labor and family.
It argues that by normalizing this situation, society is actually institutionalizing a trauma.
Which leads us directly into the daily reality of what the secular source calls the functionally single parent.
This is a really crucial concept to grasp.
It is. We aren't just talking about formal, legal, single-parent households, though those exist and are highly vulnerable. We are talking about legally two-parent families where the husband is mobilized on the front lines, missing in action, wounded, or detained in occupied territories.
So they are technically married, but functioning entirely alone.
Yes. The International Organization for Migration notes that 10% of internally displaced households fall into this specific single-parent category.
10%. That is a massive number of families.
And UNICEF reports something even more alarming. 39% of households headed by a single female caregiver are facing extreme needs. By 2023, the poverty rate for families with children grew dramatically.
The physical and administrative toll described in the first source is exhausting just to read about. I mean, I cannot imagine living it.
It sounds completely overwhelming.
A displaced mother essentially becomes a full-time case manager for her family's survival. If she is a refugee abroad, she is handling temporary protection registrations. She is figuring out local bureaucracies through translation apps on her phone.
Just think about the mental load of that.
Right. She is trying to figure out how to pay rent in a foreign currency, trying to secure medical care, and enrolling her kids in schools where they do not speak a word of the language.
All on her own.
And she is doing all of this while facing a severe increase in the threat of gender-based violence, which the OECD notes has risen by 36%.
Let's unpack the mechanism behind that specific statistic, because the 36% spike in gender-based violence does not just happen by accident.
No, there is a reason for it.
It is a direct result of policy gaps. When a mother faces delays in getting her temporary protection visa, she cannot sign a legal lease. She is forced to rent a room off the books.
Which puts her in a very vulnerable position.
Exactly. The landlord might demand illegal rent hikes or coercive favors, and because she has no legal standing or local language skills, she has no recourse to go to the police.
Wow.
The lack of structural support forces her into the shadows, directly increasing her vulnerability to exploitation.
That makes a lot of sense. The policy failure literally creates the danger. And alongside that physical danger, the psychological toll is staggering.
What did the secular text say about the kids?
It paints this vivid picture of children having to study their schoolwork during rolling blackouts. You have young kids acting as translators for their mothers in foreign government offices, taking on adult burdens.
That is a lot for a child to carry.
UNICEF warns that half of all these children are at risk of mental distress, and the mother has to absorb all of her own fear, plus the fear of her children, answering questions she has no answers for, like, when is dad coming back? Is our house still standing?
The theological source also looks very closely at this psychological trauma. It notes that 44% of refugees in neighboring nations are showing severe signs of PTSD.
But they diagnose it differently, right?
Yes, it diagnoses this distress entirely differently. It sees the psychological trauma as a symptom of a massive spiritual void. It describes the solitary hearth as being cold, lacking the spiritual leadership and protective presence of the husband.
So they view the mental health crisis as a spiritual crisis.
Yes. And crucially, instead of pointing these women toward secular therapy, state-sponsored counseling, or psychiatric interventions, the text points directly to Scripture.
Right. It references Psalm 68, verse 5, declaring God as the father of the fatherless and the protector of widows.
It also points to Romans chapter 8, verse 15, and the spirit of adoption.
So the theological argument is that the soul is in anguish because creation is groaning under the weight of sin, and the only lasting comfort is regenerating grace.
When you look at the real-world choices these women are forced to make, the divergence in how these two sources propose solutions becomes very clear.
Can you give an example?
Well, the secular source describes a mother living in poverty having to make an agonizing choice. Does she buy the medicine her child needs today, or does she pay for the internet connection so her child can attend an online school tomorrow?
That is the brutal reality of the functionally single parent. And because the isolation is so absolute, it forces a massive response from the surrounding community.
How does the secular source handle that isolation?
The secular source demands a web of mutually reinforcing safeguards. It argues you cannot just hand a mother an envelope of cash and walk away. You need income support, safe housing, legal aid, and violence prevention programs all working together in tandem to catch this mother when she falls.
The theological source insists on a completely different support system.
What do they suggest?
It argues that the covenantal community, specifically the local church, must step into the void left by the absent husband. The text explicitly rejects modern, seeker-sensitive church models that rely on entertainment or superficial community events.
So no coffee shops in the lobby.
Right. It argues that a traumatized refugee mother does not need a rock band and a coffee shop in the church lobby. She needs solid biblical exposition, the tangible sacrificial love of the communion of saints, and a sanctuary where she can find true rest in the gospel.
But, this raises a huge question about scale. This leads us to the clash of macro-level solutions, state policy versus the means of grace.
The scale is a very fair point.
The secular response involves an absolute ocean of money and logistics. We're talking about UNICEF distributing 1.85 billion Ukrainian hryvnia in cash assistance to over 67,000 households.
That is a staggering amount of money.
And the Ukrainian government itself spent 181.4 billion hryvnia on social assistance in just 2024. And you have the massive apparatus of the European Union enacting a temporary protection system that is now running through March 2027, giving millions of people legal status, health care, and the right to work.
Which is a massive logistical undertaking.
So how can a network of local churches compete with a multi-billion-dollar state apparatus?
The sociologists would say they cannot, which is why the state must intervene. The central driving argument of the secular text in this section is a concept they call care is infrastructure.
We really need to unpack how this actually works.
They are arguing that things like kindergartens, mental health centers, reliable public transportation, and safe after-school programs are not optional perks of a wealthy, peaceful society.
They are not just nice things to have.
No, they are strict, non-negotiable prerequisites for a functioning wartime economy.
I want to make sure I grasp the mechanics of that. You are saying that if the military needs a munitions plant to operate at full capacity, but there are no schools or daycares open in the area, the mothers cannot leave their children to go work on the assembly line.
Exactly.
And then the factory output drops and the front lines suffer. Therefore, building a kindergarten is literally as vital to the war effort as building a tank factory.
That is the exact mechanism the secular text is highlighting. Care work is the invisible foundation holding up the visible war effort. So if the first source sees the secular state, international NGOs, and EU directives as the primary necessary vehicles for keeping these families alive, the theological source takes a dramatically different stance on state intervention.
Okay, I have to push back here on behalf of the listener. If the theological text believes God ordains civil government, which it does, why is it so incredibly hostile to the state providing housing vouchers to freezing refugees? I mean, isn't that contradictory?
It is a nuanced critique. The theological source acknowledges that civil government is an institution ordained by God to maintain basic order and restrain evil, citing Romans chapter 13.
Right.
And it concedes that state welfare can act as a form of common grace, holding back absolute starvation. But it views trusting the state for true healing or long-term restoration as utter folly. It forcefully rejects what it calls the social gospel and critical theory.
We should probably define those terms for the listener.
Go ahead.
The social gospel was a movement that gained traction in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, primarily arguing that Christian ethics should be applied to social problems like poverty, inequality, and labor laws, often prioritizing social reform over personal salvation.
Right.
And critical theory generally refers to sociological frameworks that analyze society through the lens of power structures, oppression, and systemic inequalities.
The confessional author argues that relying on the social gospel or critical theory turns the church into a mere NGO, stripping it of its spiritual mandate.
So they see it as a distraction from the main mission.
Yes. The text argues that the state is a sterile, cold comforter. The bureaucracy can give you a housing voucher, but it cannot heal your soul. It quotes Matthew chapter 11, verse 28. "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest."
It makes me think of the difference between applying a tourniquet and giving a blood transfusion.
Oh, that is a good analogy.
The secular policies, the billions in cash transfers, the EU housing directives, they act as a rapid, essential tourniquet. They stop the immediate, fatal bleeding of wartime poverty and physical displacement. They keep the physical body alive.
Which is obviously necessary.
Yes. But the theological text comes in and argues that a tourniquet is useless if the patient is bleeding out internally. It demands a complete spiritual transfusion or regeneration that only the church can provide through the gospel.
This creates a massive tension regarding where resources and trust should be placed. The secular text urges governments to adopt gender-responsive budgeting.
What is that?
This means analyzing every national budget decision to ensure it addresses the specific needs of women, directing funds to women's organizations, and making aid eligibility transparent.
So it is very policy-driven.
Very. The theological text, on the other hand, warns the church against outsourcing its duty of Christian charity to government tax programs. It argues that reducing ministry to social work abandons the primary command to preach the word.
So they want the focus to remain spiritual.
True healing, according to this source, only happens through the ordinary means of grace, which they define as faithful preaching and the administration of the sacraments, functioning within the local church.
So if they view the immediate survival of these families so differently, we have to ask, how do these distinct viewpoints define the future? How do they define recovery when the artillery finally stops and the war eventually ends?
Because the rebuilding phase is going to be just as complicated as the crisis phase.
Yeah.
The secular source issues several strong warnings about the recovery phase. It stresses that reconstruction cannot just be about pouring concrete for new roads, repairing bridges, and rebuilding power plants.
It has to be about the people.
Yes. The core warning is that society must not normalize the overload that has been placed on women. During the emergency, women became the default earners, caregivers, and logistical organizers.
They took on everything.
The risk is that when the war ends, policymakers will simply expect them to continue carrying that impossible load without adequate pay or state support.
And there is a specific warning about what happens when the men come back from the front lines. Demobilized men are going to need immense psychological support and economic reintegration.
Which is a massive task on its own.
But the secular text insists that supporting returning veterans must not mean pushing women back into unpaid domestic care or forcing them to give up the new skills and incomes they have developed.
So they do not want to lose the ground they gained in the workforce.
Right. Furthermore, the policies regarding refugee returns have to be grounded in reality. You cannot just call people back from Germany or Poland based on patriotism. Returns have to be tied to concrete things: secure housing, guaranteed school placements, and local security.
That makes total sense.
If a mother does not have a safe school for her kids, she is not coming back, no matter how much she loves her country.
So you have this highly pragmatic, earthly recovery plan from the sociologists. Now contrast that with the sweeping cosmic conclusion of the theological source.
Okay, let's look at that.
The second text explicitly and forcefully rejects the possibility of ever building a human utopia. It scoffs at the idea of finding true salvation or lasting peace in international treaties, EU integration, or reconstructed infrastructure.
The theological source introduces a very specific eschatological framework here. It describes a premillennial, pre-tribulational view. You might need to translate that for me because that is pretty heavy theological jargon.
Sure, let's break it down. Premillennialism is the belief that Christ will physically return to Earth before establishing a literal 1,000-year reign of peace and justice.
Okay, and pre-tribulationalism.
That is the belief that the church will be caught up or removed before a specific period of intense global suffering and divine judgment known as the tribulation.
Okay, so how does that specific view shape their reaction to a war in Eastern Europe?
Because of this framework, the authors expect global conditions to deteriorate before Christ returns. They do not expect human governments to usher in a golden age. They cite Psalm 46, verse 9, anticipating a day when God alone will physically break the bow and shatter the spear.
So they're looking for a divine solution.
Yes. They view the current horrors of the war not as problems to be permanently solved by European Union grants, but as birth pangs of a groaning creation waiting for divine intervention. They place zero hope in the OECD's plans for an inclusive recovery.
And it does not let the reader off the hook either. It directs a very harsh warning to comfortable Westerners sitting far away from the conflict, analyzing it on deep dives like this one.
It points a finger right at the audience.
It does. It cites 1 John chapter 3, verse 17, which asks how God's love can abide in someone who has the world's goods, sees a brother in need, and closes his heart against him.
That is a very direct challenge.
It demands repentance for apathy. It calls for radical, personal hospitality and direct support from believers, rather than relying on the distant mechanisms of state welfare to care for the suffering.
The gap between these two endings is vast. One vision seeks a balanced, gender-responsive, earthly society built upon robust care infrastructure, equal pay, and systemic support.
And the other.
The other vision anticipates the literal end of the world as we know it, placing all its hope in a sovereign king who will wipe away every tear and execute perfect justice.
Yet, despite these massive, seemingly unbridgeable differences in their worldview, their diagnosis, and their ultimate hope, both texts agree on one undeniable, immediate reality.
What is that?
The current burden resting on the shoulders of the Ukrainian family, and specifically on the women holding those families together, is an unsustainable, crushing weight that demands a radical response right now.
That is the common denominator that grounds this entire discussion. Studying both the microscopic, logistical reality of a refugee's daily life alongside the macroscopic, eternal claims of a theological worldview provides a much clearer picture of human suffering than either perspective could offer alone.
You really need both lenses.
You do. You see the sheer physical exhaustion alongside the spiritual anguish. You see the need for both the housing voucher and the pastoral care.
We have covered a massive amount of ground today, and I want to thank you for sitting through such an intense, multi-layered examination of the source material with us. It is not an easy subject.
No, it is heavy.
It is heavy, it is complicated, and it forces us to ask really uncomfortable questions about what we value.
The contrast forces a deeper evaluation of how we understand crisis, resilience, and the institutions we rely on when the normal structures of life collapse.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as we close. When the artillery finally goes silent and the treaties are signed, will the true measure of rebuilding be found in the swiftness of economic policies returning people to work? Or will it be found in the quiet, unseen mending of the moral and spiritual foundation of a family that has spent years living out of a suitcase? Thank you for joining this deep dive on reform thinking.